Today at the National Press Club, the ambassador of Ukraine, Vasyl Myroshnychenko, the former business leader, began his diplomatic posting to Australia in April last year and briefly served as an advisor to the Ukrainian Minister of Defence.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra today for today's very special Westpac address. My name is David Crowe and I'm the Chief Political Correspondent for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald and a Director here at the Club. Our address today marks the past year of war in Ukraine and the moment on February 24 last year when Russian missiles rained down on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. It's been a year of tragedy for the people of Ukraine, a year of support from many people in Australia, and a convulsion in world politics with implications for all of us. The United Nations estimates that 14 million people have been displaced, some of them given safety here in Australia. The Pentagon estimates that more than 100,000 soldiers have been killed or wounded on each side, and thousands of innocent lives have been lost. Our guest is the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Myroshnychenko. He's someone well known to many here in Canberra, given his relentless activity on behalf of his country, even though he's only been with us for less than a year. But first, we will hear a special address to the people of Australia from the First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska. We thought it very important that we hear this special video address from somebody who can give us the voice from Kyiv. After that, we will then hear the national anthem of Ukraine, sung by the Ukrainian community of Canberra choir here on stage.
Дорогі друзі Австралії, вітаю вас. Між нами океани і тисячі кілометрів. Але для війни, горя, на жаль, немає відстаней. Якщо десь в світі відбувається агресія, вторгнення, вбивство людей, ніхто в світі не може почуватися безпечно. Бо це атака не тільки на Україну, це атака на принципи нашого співіснування в світі. Дякую вам за те, що ви це розумієте, за те, що не байдужі до долі України та світу. Ми відчуваємо вашу підтримку. Бо для допомоги і співчуття також не існує кордонів та відстаней. Ми сьогодні відзначаємо не рік повномасштабної війни. Ми відзначаємо рік спротиву агресії, рік взаємодопомоги, рік людяності, яку проявляють у порятунку один одного українці, і яку проявляєте ви. І я вірю, саме людяність та взаємодопомога переможуть. Ми переможемо. Разом із вами. Дякую.
Ще не вмерла Україна, ні слава, ні воля. Ще нам, браття українці, усміхнеться доля. Згинуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці, запануєм і ми, браття, у своїй сторонці. Душу й тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду. Душу й тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Thank you so much for that national anthem. Please join me in thanking the Ukrainian community of Canberra Choir for that national anthem then. A special thank you also, I think, to the youngest member of that choir who was so impressive there, holding it together on stage. So wonderful to see you here today. Thank you again. Now to our guest speaker. Vasyl Myroshnychenko arrived in Australia as the Ukrainian ambassador in the months after the February 24 invasion. He has a background in the private sector and in the non-government sector, including as a co-founder of the Ukraine Crisis Media Centre that amplified the voice of Ukraine at the time of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Now, that's a moment when many Ukrainians believed the war began. His background includes 6 years as partner at CFC Big Ideas, a Kyiv-based strategic communications company, and he's well known in the business sector in Ukraine. And that career came after his studies in international relations in Kyiv and a master's from the London School of Economics. We are honoured to have you here today, and we also welcome your wife, Liana. Thank you for joining us here today. I can tell you also that we have many guests in the audience, and I'd like to name them and mark our appreciation that they're here. The High Commissioner of the United Kingdom, Vicky Tredell, lovely to see you here. The Ambassador of Lithuania, Darius Degutis, thank you for joining us. The former Deputy Prime Minister and Nationals leader, Michael McCormack, thank you for joining us here today, and also Liberal Senator David Fawcett. The head of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations, Stefan Romany, thank you for joining us here today. You've done so much good work with the Ukraine Crisis Appeal. Now, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Myroshnychenko to make his address.
Sorry about that. Look, let me please start with acknowledging the indigenous people of this land, the Ngunnawal people. I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. That may we be honored to learn from their thousands years old culture. It's a strange task to talk about this 1 year of a full-fledged Russian invasion. I'm asked to somehow soberly comment on what that unprovoked, illegal, and immoral war has wrought on Ukraine and the world, and what it has taught us, what the current situation is after 12 months of Ukraine's defense, and what may happen in the future. However, for a very proud Ukrainian who has had the honor of representing his country here in beautiful Australia for the past 11 months, it is hard to lay aside the emotions one feels about this horrible anniversary. But such is my task, to contain the hurt and the horror one holds in his heart for one's countrymen, and share some thoughts that aim to assure you of a singular key aspect: that Ukraine must win, and that Ukraine will win. Ladies and gentlemen, dignitaries, members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, so many of whom I have now met and come to admire, it has been 365 days since a neighboring state made the fatal mistake of invading my country. Their rationale has changed with the seasons, but rest assured it was not to ward off the threat of NATO, not to defend the interests of Russian-speaking people, many of whom fill the ranks of Ukraine's military, not to denazify a country led by one of the 2 Jewish presidents in the world, and not to somehow reunite historic lands. Indeed, Ukraine has a sovereign history since the 10th century, predating Moscow. Rather, the invader's motive is revealed by its homicidal tactics: to destroy Ukrainian society and culture, and to create a new colony and outpost for the criminal enterprise. The full-scale invasion is a modern, mechanized, and murderous version of old-school imperialism and mafioso mentality. Tsarism meets Scarface, a horrific throwback to an era everyone thought over. As a result, for the past 365 days, my countrymen and women have suffered senseless killings, brutal rapes, and barbaric torture. 365 days in which we have seen the names of our service in cities like Irpin, Bucha, Kramatorsk, Izum, Dnipro have become synonymous with war crimes and atrocities. 365 days that we have endured air raid sirens screaming across our sophisticated cities, missiles made to destroy the battleships flying toward our homes. 365 days in which thousands of schools, hospitals, churches, museums, sports facilities, the infrastructure of well-being and community have been intentionally destroyed by enemy attacks. 365 days where 14 million people, the equivalent of more than half of Australia's population, have been made homeless and millions of families separated in what can be called a genocide by displacement. 365 days since the start of systematic filtration operations, the detentions, deportations, and disappearances, which have robbed Ukrainians of their freedom and their lives. 365 days since we took our young son to his beloved Shevchenko Park in Kyiv. The kids' playground, which was destroyed by the Russian missile. And it's also 665 days during which Ukraine conducted a successful defense against the world's so-called second greatest military, while propagandists and pundits picked us to last only 3 days. Ukraine has won decisive battlefield victories at Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, and taken nearly 50% of the occupied territory. Ukrainians have been forced to make unbelievable and unbearable sacrifices that all they want to do is to live in peace. I think here of people like Katerina from Poltava, a 26-year-old former staff of a UN women's rights program, who is now a frontline combat medic. She has lost 2 boyfriends in combat, suffers from intense PTSD, and still feels the absolute need to do her duty. Or Alexandra, a prominent blogger who volunteered in the first day of the war and mobilized himself to defend his native Kyiv with thousands of others, often using the old AK-47s and Patron bombs in the streets they grew up in. Or Sasha from Lviv, a 43-year-old pediatrician who is now with the Special Forces Reconnaissance Unit in the East. He's gone from being a doctor to become a drone operator. In the early days of the war, I lost 2 of my university classmates. Both of them studied international relations and had a dream of becoming diplomats one day. And they both were in combat in 2014, 2015. They joined defense forces right at the very beginning. One of them got killed in Hostomel on the 3rd day of war. The other one got killed in mid-March. Indeed, never for a minute should the West forget that these Ukrainians see themselves as fighting for you as much as they fight for Ukraine. Indeed, the democratic world has recognized that this is not only Ukraine's war, but it's a war too. The world has made common cause with the fight for democracy and against authoritarianism, and provided Ukraine with massive material and moral support, for which we are very grateful. The democratic world has been invigorated with a sense of unity and shared purpose in the name of liberal democratic values and in support of rules-based order. There is now common recognition that the rogue regime that seeks to wreck those rules for all must be cast as a global pariah, a terrorist state. Australia has been a real mate to Ukraine in battling a brutal bully. We know Australia supports Ukraine because Australians stand up for what's right. It is who you are as people. We know Australia supports Ukraine because Australia supports the rule of law. We know, including through the strategy of MH17 and the pointless loss of 38 Australian lives, that Australians are appalled by the Russia's actions and are committed to Ukraine. Ukraine is extremely thankful that Australia is in our blue and gold corner. Key generous commitments have included placement assistance to over 6,000, mainly women, children, refugees, and material support of some $700 million, including 90 now legendary Bushmaster vehicles on our front lines. Know this, Each additional Bushmaster isn't just a very hardy and handy battle vehicle. Rather, it is the Anzac spirit, the Australian mateship on the wheels that roll toward mutual victory. By the way, I shared the video today on Twitter of the soldiers who are there with the Bushmasters, and they are thanking Australians for support. And here I wish to formally acknowledge and thank the federal government, including the solidarity and leadership shown by the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who visited Kyiv last year, just as President Biden did this week. We continue to be inspired by the Prime Minister's strong statement there, that democratic nations like Australia will stand side by side with the Ukrainian people in the time of need. Indeed, it has been 365 days of profound global realignment we must face in 2023. While some now wish to repeatedly ask the question, how does this end? And what are in different ways subject to propaganda narratives, or the anxiety of uncertainty, or the ill discipline of quick fixes? And Ukraine is crystal clear about its future. Our road to victory will have 6 key features that I wish to communicate to you. Number 1, we will fight for as long as it takes. In the face of the enemy's genocidal aggression, we have no other option but to win. This includes, as the enemy continues its plan to destroy Ukraine by clearing its own prisons for cannon fodder, outsourcing its killing to the Wagnerite mercenaries, mobilizing for human wave attacks by untrained troops, and increasing its manufacture of weapons and ammunition. Number 2, we will start up the fight in the face of an enemy alliance of malice with the likes of Iran, North Korea, and Belarus, and we will look to our own allies to apply pressure on these countries. Every time an Iranian Shahed drone heads toward a Kyiv or Mykolaiv apartment building, it is a reminder that the enemy has escalated this war to an international level. Every time that Belarus is used as a launching pad, it is a reminder of complicity in evil that cannot be tolerated. Those that help the invader circumvent military sanctions are accomplices in war crimes. Number 3, we will never accept peace at any cost. We hear rumblings in capitals whose existence is not at stake that there needs to be negotiation or we must be prepared to make concessions. This will never happen. We will never agree to anything that keeps Ukrainian territories occupied and puts other people at the aggressor's mercy. Appeasing the aggressor now will lead to more atrocities later. Number 4, we will pursue President Zelensky's 10-point peace formula for a comprehensive, just, and long-term peace for Ukraine and security for the globe. In this respect, I hope that Australia will get involved in helping us to implement 2 tracks there, which includes nuclear safety and the environment. Also, you've seen the vote in the United Nations just several hours ago. We had 141 countries who have supported a resolution on the peace in Ukraine. And it's a big victory because that resolution includes the withdrawal of the Russian troops from Ukraine, restoring Ukraine's sovereignty completely and entirely. 141 countries have supported. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the government of Australia and the government of New Zealand for your support in reaching out to the Pacific countries and working here in the region to make sure that we have support for that vote in the UN. Over the next period, through work on the peace formula and through discussion of reconstruction, the world will see and realize that our fight is not only for the peaceful, independent, and democratic Ukraine. It is for a society where our citizens are fully empowered in their universal human rights. It is for a country rebuilt as a European leader politically, economically, and socially. We are now earning that opportunity with a sacrifice for others. Number 5, we will strongly partner with our allies for Ukraine to have the range of modern weapons and ammunition it needs to not only defend itself, but to achieve victory. There is a very straightforward formula here. More military support equals a quicker end to Russia's war on Ukraine and democracy. It's not only war on Ukraine, it's also war on democracy. In the case of Australia, the more Aussie material support, the faster our victory will be. Again, we cannot be more grateful for the support provided by Australia and our many other allies to date. Bushmasters, Javelin-type anti-tank weapons, Howitzer-type artillery batteries, multi-purpose armored vehicles, sophisticated air defense, and long-distance guided missile systems, the HIMARS, and now tanks turn the tide of battle against an enemy which has advanced over quality. As recently as last week, 20,000 enemy shells per day, or 15 per minute, were being fired against Ukrainian positions. Not many of you here know, but Australia spends 15,000 rounds in a year in training. And we're talking about 20,000 in a day. This is the number of shells we just sent at Ukrainians. We have sustained some 50 major planned missile attacks of up to 100 missiles per attack against our cities. Wars are conspicuous consumers of material. Wars change shape and direction with time and terrain. While we are thankful for what has been received, Ukraine must convince its allies that military aid cannot be one-off, sporadic, only symbolic in 2023. Military aid must meet battlefield needs and strategic opportunities. It needs, therefore, to be substantive, systematic, and consistent. Most importantly, military aid needs to be goal-based, namely, to secure Ukraine's victory. If the goal in 2022 was to defend Ukraine, the goal in 2023 is for Ukraine to win for the world's sake. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no such thing as escalatory self-defense. The fact of the matter is that our enemy, and especially its leader, who is more subject to KGB training and the mentality of a mafia regime, he presides over and escalates when the West takes its foot off the brakes, not when he accelerates it. In other words, we really have to step it up. That's the only thing that they understand. Because in that system, it's only strengths which Russians can get, and this is what they can react to. The Kremlin thug exploits weakness and he fears strengths. That is a challenge and the opportunity for our allies and ourselves. It is absolutely essential going into the second year of the war and with the enemy now being pushed back to have the strengths that victory requires. Conversely, there is a risk of falling into the convenient mode of risk management thinking or adopting a realpolitik fiction that we will return to some previous status quo or stupidly believing that Vladimir can be appeased or succumbing to the fatigue in the media cycle or to the short-term domestic pressures. To make any of those mistakes is to devalue the moral, political, and strategic equity and the core strengths and the clarity of purpose that the West, Australia, and Ukraine have built up this year. The reality is this: we must be stronger still to keep our strategies aligned and to enhance the type of weaponry provided by the West, to include the modern tanks, missiles, and yes, fighter jets that are needed to drive the aggressor back to Ukraine's internationally recognized boundaries. We need to have at least the same weapons as the aggressor is invading us with. Weapons parity is frankly not a huge ask when so many lives are at stake. A war of attrition, a frozen conflict, a bloody stalemate can and should be avoided. In the case of Australia, we're optimistic that our positive and consistent dialogue with the government will continue to yield vital aid of what Australia is best placed to provide: ordnance and bushmasters. Whether Australia, Ukraine, or otherwise, this war will not be won by business as usual. It will be won by all those on the side of democracy being beyond brave. To overcome our shared challenge, we need to, as strengths, we last mastered in the Second World War. Historically, whether World War I, World War II, or the formation of the United Nations, Australia has always shown greater strengths in the world than its size would ordinarily dictate. The war for democracy is an opportunity for that greatness to shine again, to show mateship, to save lives, to defend values, and to pursue peace. In 1949, after Australia navigated through a brutal but essential war and bravely contributed to victory over fascism in both Europe and the Pacific, then the Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, said the following: "The Labour government has faithfully carried out its duties and obligations in the field of international relations. The policy pursued has been based on a fundamental belief that the overwhelming desire of the people of Australia and of all the countries is that the world peace must be preserved, and is the basis which that peace can be built must be strengthened. In the troubled state of international relations today, there is an obligation on all to participate actively in the struggle for the maintenance of world peace and security." Chifley was right, and it is appropriate for the contemporary government continues that legacy of contribution, form a position of strength toward world peace, strength in the form of consistent military support for Ukraine. I wish to really drive this point home. Australian support has been so welcome and so vital. Now, moving into year 2, mutual victory requires that our allies' support be sustainable and systematic. That's the difference between defending a mate and winning a better world order for everyone. The last point, number 6, of our framework for the future is that every war enemy criminal must be punished. The establishment of a special tribunal will ensure that the enemy's political and military leadership will be prosecuted for their complicity in great crimes, including the very act of aggression. Ladies and gentlemen, if I might sum up Ukraine's position at this year mark, the aggressor's full-scale invasion of Ukraine for a year has shown that Ukraine is a stronghold of democracy. The Kremlin's plans to destroy Ukrainian statehood have failed. Ukraine will never give up on freedom, humanity, respect for individuals, following state obligations, following international law. Ukraine, unlike its enemy, continues to be a nation run by and for the people, not by the dictator for personal gain. In conclusion, let me circle back. I'm often asked how long this war will last. But the question of how long is less important than the question that how Ukraine's victory can be secured. The answer to that is that the more Ukraine can continue to work with our allies, the more we can tap into Aussie mateship, the faster we will achieve victory for Ukraine and for democracy. Look, I'm an optimist, and I really believe that this will happen. And there will be plenty of opportunities for us to further work on our bilateral relations. I see tremendous opportunities in trade and investment between our two countries. I see numerous opportunities in Ukraine's rebuild and reconstruction. In this, I would like to also acknowledge the help of Dr. Andrew Forrest and his wife, Nicola, who have helped Ukraine on a number of occasions already. They committed money for the Ukrainian farmers. They also recently dispatched 100 power generators to Ukraine. And most importantly, they made a commitment of $500 million for a big reconstruction of Ukraine, of the rebuild of Ukraine's infrastructure and communications. I hear more and more Australian entrepreneurs are keen to look in those opportunities. And I think we have to think about a positive picture. We have to see what is at the end of that tunnel. There is a light there. And once we win, those opportunities will be abound. And I believe, because originally when I was coming here and when I was pitching myself for the job to come here to Australia, my pitch was on commercial diplomacy, on economic diplomacy, trade, investment. That is what I was hoping to be doing here. And for the past 11 months, it was mostly doing defense and military and security issues. But I really believe, and I'm optimistic, that there will be a day when we'll get back to a positive agenda and to doing something more practical and more pragmatic, which will be of great help to Ukraine. Well, thank you for your attention. I was very pleased to be here, and I'm happy to get your questions and answer them all. And by the way, there will be also a video from Andrew Forrest at the end of my Q&A. I mentioned him, but you will see it later on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm glad there were tissues on the lectern, because your speech reminded us all, I think, of the fact that there is so much personal pain in this war. There's so much raw emotion in what's been happening. We're accustomed to talking about it in cold and rational terms often, but you're reminding us of that pain. And so my first question, before we go to other journalists here, is really about that, because I know you've been able to go back to Ukraine since you came here last April. You're very much in touch with people in your home city and also in the capital, Kyiv. And I'm interested in your view of just how the people can sustain the terror that comes with air raid sirens and with missile attacks in the night. How are they holding up? And it does get back to that question, How long can they sustain this fight?
That's a very good question, and indeed I was able to go 4 times to Kyiv since I arrived here, and I was there in June, July, then later at the end of October, and also in December. And as you know, and every time I had a different impression. Maybe it's because of the season. You know, when you come during the summer, the days are long. It looks more optimistic. And then when I was there in December, it was a different picture. It's winter. You see a city in blackouts. Then I was there for the annual ambassadors meeting, and we had a field trip to Mykolaiv, which is a city in the south. And we all, as ambassadors, Ukrainian ambassadors, we all came to Kyiv, and then we traveled by train to Mykolaiv. And Mykolaiv is only 70 kilometers from Kherson. This is where, you know, Kherson is heavily shelled on the daily basis. And seeing that destruction in Mykolaiv was very heartbreaking. You know, we saw that building of that regional government where over 10 people got killed, but a huge missile. It must have been a ballistic missile because it was a big building. It just totally collapsed, and there's a big hole in the middle. And just seeing all of that is really, you can't be neutral to that. When I was there with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, we went to Bucha, went to Irpin, and I remember, you know, when we pushed Russians out of Kyiv in early April, you remember those stories from Bucha, Irpin, how painful it was, and I was here retelling the story, what has happened there. But let me tell you, it was a totally different experience when I was actually there, on the ground, listening to witness accounts, being there at that church where they show you the grounds where 200 people were buried. It's a different experience. Once you see it, once you hear it, you can't forget it. It does have an impact on you emotionally and for your life. And I think one of the major issues that Ukrainians will have to deal with is psychological issues. How do we overcome the trauma? How do we overcome what we're going through?
Our next question is from Pablo Viñales from SBS.
Ambassador Pablo Viñales, SBS World News, thank you so much for your address. You mentioned the humanitarian visas that Australia has provided. Today, the federal opposition here has called for that. It says generous and easier pathway to be maintained. Given how protracted this war is becoming, would you like to see this program become more generous and see more Ukrainians come to Australia?
Look, we welcome the humanitarian assistance which was provided by Australia so far, and that was Ukrainian community, which are also here in the room. They were heavily involved in making sure they can collect humanitarian assistance and to be able to ship it to Ukraine. Taking the opportunity, I would like to thank Australian Defence Forces who are also here for assistance with shipping some of that humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, primarily provided to displaced people, provided to the refugees. We have, according to the statistics, only about 6,000 people, Ukrainians, who made it here to Australia. We have about 5 million who are now in Europe, scattered around. We have 1.5 million in Poland, almost 1 million in Germany, almost 100,000 in the UK. They're all over Europe. And of course, if more people, Ukrainians, could come here as temporary state protection, that would be good. And I think that would be a good thing to do.
Our next question is from Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter.
Ambassador, thank you again very much for your moving speech. Bushmasters, how many of them would you like? Because if the dynamic doesn't change, the factory in Bendigo that makes them will shut down in about 6 months' time. So if you really want them and the Australian government comes to the party, it could be a win-win, preserving what little remains of Australia's industrial base, and it would help Ukraine. What do you think of the idea?
It's a great idea, I think. I fully support it, but I would leave it up to your government to provide more comments on that. I mean, look, it's not about the numbers. You see, in the past, I was always saying, oh, we need another 30 Bushmasters, we need another, you know, whatever. But I think what's important now is about how we can sit down, and this is what we are doing with the Australian government. Let's sit down and let's talk about the plan. Because the plan and assistance should be systematic and should be consistent, right? It could not be, you know, last year it was kind of, you know, look, it was sporadic everywhere, right? We didn't know how long it's going to last, what's going to happen. But I think now, but 1 year has passed, we really need to come up with a plan. So, you know, that's a good idea. I'm sure we'll discuss it, we'll use it, and I hope we'll be able to share some of the outcomes sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you.
I might just add a question there before we go to the next one. Are Bushmasters what's really needed at this stage? I know there was an agreement recently between Australia and France to support Ukraine by providing more ammunition, artillery ammunition. Is that a more practical way to offer support rather than Bushmasters, given they're so big and it's so difficult to transport them all that way?
Look, to be more specific, of course, ammunition is in huge demand. Currently, 155mm ammunition is very difficult to find, and the needs are very high. But look, again, it's not about something specific, right? I'm very thankful to the government and the announcement today about the reconnaissance drones, which will be dispatched to Ukraine. That's going to be very helpful. But, you know, when we kind of bogle down what exactly we need, when you can provide, there are many things which Australia could provide. There are many things that Australia could also buy for Ukraine elsewhere, as it was happening in the past. So it's not really about some certain types or certain platforms. What's important that support is continued, it's sustained, and it's systematic. It's kind of, you know, that's an ask of the Ukrainian government.
Thanks. Next question is from Tim Shaw.
Thank you, David. Excellency, Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. Thank you very, very much for your address today. You may have noticed that we have a free press in this country. TV Rain is a Russian media organisation that has been based in the Netherlands and has been reporting from Latvia. The hearts and minds of the Russian people are clearly in the mindset of President Putin. Can you just take us on a journey of the Ukraine journalists that are working under very, very difficult conditions, and also comment upon the fact that there are independent Russian journalists trying to provide the Russian people with information, but it is being blocked, unsurprisingly. Can you just comment from your own media experience about the battle for hearts and minds with the Russian people?
Oh, that's a very good question, to be frank, because it's not an easy answer here. The fight for the Russian hearts and mind is very important. And the thing is that Putin has created a system for the past 22 years where the Kremlin narrative is so prevalent and is so dominating, and actually that so many Russian people are supporting this war. We may call this war Putin's war, but at the end of the day, who are those people who are committing all those war crimes? Who are those people who are raping women and children? Who are they? Are they Putin? Is it Putin doing it? It's done by the Russian soldiers. About 145,000 of those were already killed in Ukraine. There'll be more. And at the end of the day, what's happening is, and the support for this war is pretty high. And apparently, a lot of that is due to that propaganda and brainwashing, which was created by the Kremlin, right? Pretty much all state-run television, state-run TV, full control of the social media, whatever they also do, you know, pushing the false narratives outside of the country, and actually exerting influence. And we see that battle for the global south, and this is where the Russians have been able to really work hard to convince the developing countries that this war is the fault of the West. And this is really appalling, and I think the global West and the global free world should deal with that, because at the end of the day, using this colonial rhetoric by Russia to demonstrate that starvation in Africa is caused because your former capitals, you know, when the times of colonies have used it against you. What a cynicism, right? The fact that Russians have undermined, you know, food security of so many countries, energy security of so many countries. It's important that this message is communicated well. And we really appreciate Australian support and engagement here in the region, working with your partners, including Indonesia. Indonesia is a strategic defense partner for Australia. 275 million people are there. They depend on Ukrainian food. They depend on the price of food they buy. So it's in the interest of everybody that we end this war. We can stop this, you know, volatility on the global commodity markets. But fight for the hearts and minds is still a long way to go. It's not going to be that easy, because you already have generations of Russians who believe in that. They actually push Putin to crack hard on Ukraine. They demand the use of technical nuclear weapons. And we have a big part of the Russian society who demand it. Look, of course, there are many exceptions. There are many Russians who oppose that. But we believe in Ukraine that if you don't like your leader, go on the streets. And Ukrainians have proved, because we're a freedom-loving nation who love and admire democracy, that once you go to the streets, you can take down your leaders. We've done it twice in our history. And if 2 million Russians came to the streets of Moscow, nobody could stop them. Nobody, you cannot jail 2 million people. And we don't see it coming. Even those Russians who are fleeing and because they don't want to be conscripted in the war, do you see them demonstrating a lot? No, they are not. I mean, it's a very complicated issue. We'd be happy to do a separate talk on this. And we could delve deeper. I mean, it's not that, I mean, there are many different facets, and we're here in a room of journalists. You know how Russians are exploiting your democracy and your freedom of speech. It's very easy, and they've been very good at it, because for any journalist who's writing a story, it has to be a balanced story. So on one hand, you have truth, right? On the other hand, you have the opinion of Russia, and you blend it through, and this is how you get the false narrative. This is how you don't get an accurate picture, because on the other side, it's just manufactured and fake story. But for any Western journalist, they kind of like, no, we have to run a fair story, right? Two sides of the story, right? It doesn't work like that. But this is a weakness that Russians have been exploiting in a democracy, undermining you know, using different active measures, that's the term used by the KGB, to undermine democratic societies. And there are so many ways to do it. You know, run conspiracy theories, run anti-vaxxers, all these protesters, anti-establishment. Don't trust your media because it's a big conspiracy theory, right? This is what's happening. There are many people like that even in Australia here, right? They just believe in those theories, right? And this is what makes it very dangerous, because once you don't believe your government, you don't believe the mainstream media, you can believe in anything, right? And then there is a call for action, right? We don't know what that call is going to be, but it's going to come. And you better be prepared for that. You need to be sure how you're going to deal with that and how you're going to counteract it and to actually stop it from the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. On the subject of misinformation, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age today had a report saying that there was a hive of spies based at the Russian embassy. Many of them have left the country, but I wonder about your view of that espionage being conducted in Australia on behalf of the Russian government. Does it concern you that they were here for so long and that they, in fact, stayed here after our authorities had identified them?
Look, it's not up for me to comment, to be frank. It's up to your counterintelligence agencies to establish evidence and deal with that, of course. It's pretty clear we know how spies work. We know what they are doing here. Also, speaking of the Russian embassy, we are watching the news and actually the developments around the land to build the new embassy. And under the current conditions and given the current circumstances, we think that Ukraine still has a very strong case to be given that plot of land to build Ukraine's embassy. Look, Russia is not participating in international diplomacy or international relations as a good faith actor. We see it.
Our next question is from Nicole Hegarty from the ABC.
Nicole Hegarty from ABC News. As we head into the second year of this full-scale war, we've seen repeated images and examples of the strength of the Ukrainian people and the army. But when it comes to a question of resources, as this continues to go on, the pool is smaller in terms of trained professional defence force compared to the aggressor of Russia. What does that mean for Ukraine heading into this next year? Will you be looking for more fighters from countries coming from afar to help bolster the numbers to continue the war?
Look, we don't need foot on the ground. We don't need your soldiers fighting out there. What we appreciate the training that is provided by the Australian Defence Forces to the Ukrainian soldiers. And I was following closely the trip of the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defence, Richard Marles, and Minister Penny Wong to Britain when they could go there and see there. And also my friend Vicky Treadle was there with them. And I could see the footage of that training. And I think it's very strong. It's very strong in many different ways. And I saw Minister Wong the other week, and she told me about her impressions, and she was moved by what she's seen. She was talking to those people there, and there was one guy who was a farmer, there was one guy who was a postman. Neither one of those had any training in the past, but they all, some people volunteered, some people were conscripted. The conscription is going on the regular basis. Ukraine is a country of 44 million people, so we still have resources, and we still have many people who are volunteers who are joining voluntarily. What we need is, of course, we need the training, we need the armor, we need the weapons, and we need the equipment so that they are able to use it to defend the country. So this is most needed. And of course, Ukraine needs financial assistance to survive. And speaking of that, for instance, Norway has recently announced a multi-year plan of 7.5 billion euro, which are planned for the next 3 or 5 years of assistance. Japanese government of Japan just committed $5.5 billion for Ukraine's reconstruction in the future. So we already see that substantive, systematic approach of how we're going to deal with that, how we're going to help Ukraine. And of course, it's important to acknowledge the support of the EU. EU has contributed collectively to 67 billion euro of assistance. So that support is coming from British, coming from American, coming from Canadians. It's out there. What's important, of course, for us, it must be sustained. And in that respect, I hope it will happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from one of Australia's great advocates for media freedom. But before I throw to the question, I think I should note that we've had a question about media freedom already, but I should note that in this room we have photographs taken by Gary Ramage in Ukraine. Wonderful photographs, heartrending in many ways, from Ukraine. And it's worth pointing out so many Australian journalists have visited Ukraine to report on what's happened in the country over the last year. Our question is from Peter Grester.
Thank you very much, David. Ambassador Peter Grester from the Alliance for Journalist Freedom and Macquarie University. I just wanted to pick up from the question that Tim asked, but also turn to the question of domestic media freedom. In any conflict, we know governments have a tendency to want to control the message, a tendency towards censorship. And last December, your government passed a media bill that has been criticised for expanding government control over media licensing and questioned the independence of a media regulator. Are you prepared to guarantee, are you able to guarantee continued media freedom in your country, particularly with regard to the front lines and reporting on the conflict?
Look, absolutely. Media freedom is essential for any democracy. At the times of war, we have certain legislation which is, due to security reasons and other concerns, it's curtailed. It happens everywhere. And that's unfortunately the situation that we have. And the issue of media freedom has always been at the top of the agenda. The problem in Ukraine is not about media freedom. It's about the ownership of the media. It's a bit more complicated because pretty much most of the media in Ukraine is controlled by the oligarchs, right? By the bigger people who own, big asset owners, as we call them, right? That was always an issue. But we've always had lots of plurality and lots of different opinions in Ukraine. What's important that we come out of this war with much healthier democracy, with more freedom, and with all rights resumed. And it's very important. It's very important for President Zelensky. It's very important for our government. It's very important for our European integration and other further steps we're going to be making. Look, Ukrainian media space is so different from the Russian media space, which there is no independent media there at all. I mean, all Russian independent media is reporting from Riga or Vilnius, right? Whoever is still there, right? But it's gone. In Ukraine, it's very vibrant. We have lots of also independent media, lots of startups, even some independent groups which start from a blog and turn it into a media platform, and everybody's reading it, right? And also today's print is gone in Ukraine by now. I think we've kind of and it's interesting. Some things in Ukraine happen much faster than in the Western world, especially like when you talk about print, right? For some reason, print is almost kind of extinct now, but now it's all turned into online, into new platforms, media platforms, and TV online. So it's there. But look, it's a good question, and I'm sure this is Ukrainian society overall. And look, I'm not a public servant. I'm now a public servant, but before that, I was in civil society and I was in the private sector. And all of these people are my friends who represent independent media, who are out there fighting for the media rights and making sure that they are observed and they are respected. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I say long live print, by the way, Ambassador.
Oh, sorry about that.
I have a question about Australian support for Ukraine, but I thought I would preface it with my encounter with a family in Borodyanka last July, their home had been demolished, totally demolished by rocket fire and artillery. This is just outside Kyiv. And they spoke to me about their experience of losing their home and all their possessions in a completely dry-eyed manner. A woman, her husband and their young teenage daughter. Only when I mentioned to them that there was support from the people of Australia did the mother cry. It was a reminder to me of the impact on people of just the knowledge that there is support in a country so far away. But I know that Ukraine fatigue is an issue. And so I have a question for you about whether you have any concern that as the war goes on, whether Ukraine fatigue will become a bigger issue and will actually undermine some of that support from around the world.
And that's a very good question. I think this is what Vladimir Putin is betting on, for the world to get tired of this war, of that fatigue, and like, oh, let's achieve peace, let's just stop it, right? And I often get this question from many different corners, from journalists as well. And I can understand that ask for peace. What's important is that we get this ask for justice. In this particular case, justice is very important. We can't leave those crimes against humanity, war crimes, crime of aggression. It cannot be left unpunished. And that's very important. And every time I get that question again, you know, like, oh, when this going to end? What can we do? Why don't you just start negotiating? You know, and I think this is just something we're not ready. I was talking to a journalist the other day, and she asked me exactly the same question. You know, you're on this morning radio show, and they ask you about that. Why don't you want to save lives and everything? And I kind of get this question, but I say, look, you get somebody who breaks into your house, rapes your wife, takes your best room, and says, look, I'm not going to kill you, but I'm going to leave here, I'm going to rape your wife, and that's a compromise. Can we reach it? We're in that situation now. We just can't afford it.
Our next question is from Nicholas Stewart.
Thank you. It's terrific that you managed to get 141 countries to actually support Ukraine. But that is not a theory of victory. How is it that you actually change the mind of Vladimir Putin? Because it seems to me that even if you attack, say a drive to the south does recapture or attempt to get close to Mariupol again, you still have the risk of nuclear weapons being used against you. You still have to push so much at places like Bakhmut. You've been unable to hold the city because of the human waves of Russian assaulters. How is it that you can actually come up with a theory that gives you victory, which means you've got to change something in Putin's mind?
Look, it's a good question, and I get it quite often. I think I just want to remind you that in 1994, Ukraine gave up one of the largest stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the world. We had 1,000 strategic missiles which were in Ukraine. We voluntarily have given up, and we were the only country in the world that done it, along with Kazakhstan. So two of us, right, who gave it up. And we received assurances from Russian government, from British and American government that our sovereignty and security will be intact. And what do we have now? And as you know, the nuclear treaty entails that a country which has nuclear weapons cannot threaten a country which does not. And this is exactly what is happening. So the solution to this problem is eternal deterrence. And I have some lines here that I want to actually read out to you because I think this is a very good idea. How can we deter Russia from doing anything in the future, but also what could be a solution as we move forward. Russia must be deterred from further aggression. Russia must be deterred from its territorial ambitions and its illegal annexations of Ukraine's sovereign territory. Russia must be deterred from using the wholesale targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure as a strategy of war. Russia must be deterred from using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And the only way how we can guarantee that, this is when we demonstrate resolve. Because if we don't, the reputation of the United Nations is undermined. The UN charters, the gravitas of UN charters is ignored. What's the credibility of the permanent members of the UN? It's gone. If we allow Russia to do what they've done and to stay there in any way. So I think it's not a question for Ukraine. I think it's more of a question to collective security in the world? How can we restore it? How can we change his mind? I don't know. I mean, I think it can be changed when he's gone.
Our next question is from Pablo Vinales.
Ambassador, Labor, the current government, has previously mulled over expelling the Russian ambassador here in Australia, and as we've reached this first anniversary, that suggestion's been made again. In your view, would there be any benefit to that?
Look, it's up to the Australian government to comment. I don't really have any comments on that. Thank you.
Our next question is from King Bergman.
Ambassador, sorry to stress you further, but another area of concern recently is what's happening in Moldova. I was wondering if you could just explain for everyone listening in what's been happening there and what would be the consequences for the security of Ukraine if Russia were to be successful in interfering with politics there.
Look, Moldova is our neighbor next door. Moldova has been a target of the Russian attack from a long time. It's pretty much after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russians have actually created a Transnistrian republic, which was not recognized by any other country. And it's short swathes of land, which has 700,000 people there between two rivers, right? And that was the base of a large Soviet military base. And it's out there still, undermining Moldova one way or another. But Russia has been always meddling into Moldova's internal affairs. The nation is small. It depends on the Russian gas. It's out there in between, squeezed in between Ukraine and Romania, and Russia in that way that Russia is heavily present there. And I think for Moldova, I think they are just a target for Russia, their next target. And since they don't really have defense forces to fight for, they understand that a lot will depend on how everything plays out in Ukraine. So government of Moldova has been very supportive of Ukraine. And of course, Moldova is in the strategic interest of Romania. And Romania has been very active in that respect. And we hope that Russians will not succeed in undermining Moldova. They've done it a number of times in the past. They do have a sway there. They know how they can leverage a smaller nation. And of course, the security of Moldova depends on how this war is going to end, and we hope it's going to end with our victory, so that they are safe with Ukraine. Thank you.
Could it be a serious threat to Ukraine if Russia succeeds there?
Look, Russians. There were many different kind of assessments. Would Russia use Transnistria as a way to attack Odessa? And Transnistria is very close to Odessa, especially in the early days of the war when Russians have taken over Kherson. And they were trying to move further east to Mykolaiv. And the idea, there was a lot of work predicting that if they use those armed forces stations in Transnistria to close and to cut us off completely from the Black Sea. We don't rule it out. And I think it was our intelligence was estimating that that could happen. Nevertheless, I think the resistance on the ground was so strong that it didn't happen, I mean, at that stage. But look, it's possible, yes.
Our next question, in fact, our last question, is from Maurice Riley, the Chief Executive of the National Press Club.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Ambassador. There is media reporting about the potential of the Russian and Chinese leaders meeting. Good or bad?
Look, Maurice, it depends on how you look at this, right? On one hand, we urge China to use their leverage on Russia to convince Russia to pull out of Ukraine. If that is used for that purpose, I think it's good. If that meeting is used to come up with a plan how to supply Russia with weapons, I think it's bad. If you can tell me what they're going to be discussing there, I can give you a clear answer.
I'll put a call in for you.
Yeah, thank you.
But are you worried at the way in which China has purchased Russian oil, has given Russia some support so far?
Absolutely. China is using that situation, for their benefit in many different ways. But look, China is an important trading partner for Ukraine. In fact, it was the largest trading partner for Ukraine before the war started, if we don't take EU collectively as a market, right? So for us, and they've been buying 20% of the grain that China used to be importing was from Ukraine. China also has invested in some infrastructure in Ukraine. Ukraine is part of this road and belt initiative which China has to Europe. So we believe it's not in the interest of China for this war to end, and President Zelensky has been calling on for a meeting or a call with a leader of China to discuss it. It hasn't yet happened. And we see the developments, we see what's happening now with the top Chinese diplomat being in Moscow. A good thing is that he had a meeting with foreign minister on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. So there is a dialogue and out there. And look, it's a bit complicated, of course, but this is what it is. This is where we are. Yeah, thank you.
And that is a reminder of how much at stake there is right now. Please join me in thanking the Ambassador for his address today.